Uh, Thank you all for joining us for the Technology Policy Institute lunchtime seminar. Today we're honored to have Dr. Catherine Tucker. She is the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Management Science and a Professor of Marketing at MIT Sloan. She's also chair of the MIT Sloan PhD program. And today she will be discussing her brand new paper, Social Distancing, Internet Access, and Inequality. Before I hand it over, I just want to note that Catherine has said she is happy to take questions while she's speaking. We don't have to wait till the end. So if you have a question, raise your hand or type it in the Q&A and she'll try to answer right away. So with that, I will hand it over.
Okay, that is utterly wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for attending. Now, I have some rather traditional slides to share, so I'm going to share my screen right now. And what I'm going to be talking about today is some very new work that I have done about the digital divide and why it matters in this era of the pandemic. And this is joint work with Leslie Chu. It's very new. And so, as I said before, your questions, your comments, your ideas for improvement are all incredibly welcome because it will be very valuable to us. So what are we trying to do here? Well, our research question is really trying to understand the relative role of the internet and access in particular to high-speed internet in how important it is in people's ability to protect themselves from the pandemic. Now, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this, I think, in reaction to two things which I've seen in the media. And the first point, which I think you've seen in the media too, is that many of our favorite newspapers have devoted many columns to the idea of massive inequality in terms of the ability to self-distance and stay at home. And I have here a tweet from the New York Times. I'm sure you saw it, it was all around Twitter. But they basically said, look, if you look at rich areas, you look at poor areas, it seems to be a very different pattern. Now, the reason we found that provocative is that there was no real discussion about the role of technology in enabling this. And what we know in the world of digital economics is that there's been a very long and old debate about the digital divide and how it interacts with income and inequality. And just to remind you of this entire debate, if we were to go back 15, 20 years, it would have probably been a major topic of policy. This idea that the rich had access to the internet and the poor didn't, and that was a digital divide. I would argue that really in recent years, we've been hearing a lot less about it. And I think perhaps that was some optimism coming from the spread of cellular technology, some perception perhaps that at least in our bubbles, everyone seemed to have the internet now. And so we've heard a lot less about this debate, but I want to make the argument today that actually the digital divide is becoming more and more pressing and more and more important. And really, the importance has been laid bare in this pandemic. So what are we going to find? I'm going to sort of give you the results right now, just so and then I'll tell you how we got them. We're going to find that income and access to high-speed internet is going to be important when you measure whether people can self-isolate. But what's particularly important, maybe that's not surprising, what's really important and new and novel in our study is that we show that together they have a complementary effect. They appear to be self-reinforcing. It's really their combination which is allowing people to successfully self-isolate. And as I said, my prediction from this is that this digital divide means that there's going to be more resonating negative effects in terms of inequality than perhaps we ever imagined as a result of this pandemic. So those are bold words, but that's going to be my contention. Now, let me go on to actually tell you how we got here. And I must admit, it's unusual to have data which is so straightforward to answer a question about the digital divide. So let me go through it in some depth. The first type of data we used was data from a company named SafeGraph. And SafeGraph has a business model whereby they track users through their cell phones. And the way they do this is that they have relationships with a variety of apps, and users have opted in to having their location being tracked at all times by these apps. Now, this is, useful data if you're a retailer, and indeed, Safeguard's business model is basically selling this data to retailers and analysts. But you can do a lot more with this data, and one of the things they were willing to do and share with researchers is to actually measure whether or not one of these mobile devices left its home. Now, what do we mean by the home? Well, the home is simply where the mobile device seems to spend most of its time overnight. And so take that as the home and allocate that for the month, and then measure whether on each day the device appeared to leave the home. And so our key measure of self-isolation is going to be the proportion of devices that SafeGraph is tracking that leave a census tract on a day. And so notice that this is quite granular data. It's by the day. And it's also at the census tract level, which is really quite a sort of granular geographic level. Now, I just want to make an aside here that quite apart from how I'm using this data, which is really to answer a policy question, I feel, if we were in normal times, we would be having a great debate when thinking about this data. In that location data is one of the things that often comes up when we're having debates about privacy. And, here is a demonstration of a case where this data does seem to have a broader use. And, the trade-offs here are quite evident, right, between surveillance and the policy goals. The other thing I think is interesting is if you've been involved in some of the debates in Washington, there's been a lot of talk about the value of data and how some big digital platforms have access to all this data. And I just found it fascinating that SafeGraph, which is a pretty small company, has managed to assemble such detailed granular data of the very type that's being held out as being the source of Facebook and Google's market power. So that's a policy aside for normal times, but because of the times we're in, let's focus in on this particular dependent measure. Now, we're going to combine that with data from the American Community Survey. Those of you who work in the economics of digitization, the economics of the internet, will know that this is one of our best ways of measuring internet penetration at the household level. This data is from 2018. It was just released at the beginning of this year, so it's really the most recent data we have. And this large survey of households, we find out whether or not they have access to broadband internet in the house. We know about their household income. We also know about a lot about other demographics. Now, we're focusing on high-speed internet. And I find it very interesting that we haven't had so much debate about high-speed internet, at least as a central policy question for many years in the community of economists I dwell in. But I'm going to show that high-speed internet does seem to have a meaningful effect in people's behavior. Right. So we're going to combine this in with some other data. We have detailed data from the National Association of Governors about what date and what time each state adopted a safe at home order. As you will know, there are many varieties of these directives. Some are more permissive than others. Some are set up to be very much, you shouldn't leave your house. Some are more framed as a safe at home style of order and as suggestive. But we're going to treat them all as similar. And the way we're going to be measuring them as similar as is we're going to define as a safe at home order the point in time when that particular governor defined a list of essential businesses which were allowed to remain open. So think of this as the timing when each individual state said, our subset of businesses, whether it be grocery stores, whether it be gun shops, whatever that state governor thought important, is going to be the only businesses we're allowed to have open. We're also, of course, going to have data on the number of reported coronavirus cases in that county. So just a little note on this, of course, testing is inadequate. We're just measuring the reported number of cases, but we argue that's still going to be important for people's behavior, what's being reported out there. All right, so that's the data setup. Do we have any questions about the data or anything that sort of has struck people about how we're assembling this together? So I'm going to give you some time to dwell on that because I'm not seeing any questions. And I'm actually going to go straight to the results, which might, might provoke some thoughts. So this is, I think, a graph which summarizes our big result. And on the y-axis, we have the percentage of devices which remained at home. And that is going to be our measure of whether or not you are effectively able to self-isolate, whether you're able to effectively protect yourself from the pandemic. And what we have here in the bar chart is we have a division of the world into regions which are in the bottom quartile of diffusion of high-speed broadband and the top quartile of high-speed broadband, and also a division into the bottom quartile of income and the top quartile of income. Oh, so we have a question here, which is what is the number of cell phones per census tract that we looked at? We have 20 million overall, I can tell you that. And if you give me a moment, I should be able, I will look up soon what the actual number is. But typically in a census tract, my memory is in the hundreds, but I can definitely verify that as we go ahead. Think of it in some sense of 20 million cell phones spread across all the census tract in the US. We did a little bit of checks for selection, but we didn't see it. But it seemed to be pretty, much what you'd expect given population. All right, so I love that question. I got distracted from describing the graph. And really, we're then going to divide up by the bottom and top quartile of income. And what you can see here is what happens before and after the directive was in place in that state. You can see that in general, there's roughly about a 10–15% increase in devices staying at home. In some sense, I find that quite striking, which is that, we're not at 50%, we're not really reaching 50% of devices staying at home at any point, right? It's still the case that many devices seem to be on the move. So I find that interesting as a sort of first order point when we think about how successful isolation is. The next thing to say is, so we definitely see an increase in devices staying at home after the directive. You see, before the directive, there's not really much to sort of take between, or difference to really note between behaviors depending on internet or income. But after the directive, we do see two striking differences. The first is even in the bottom quartile of the internet, income matters a little bit. And, you know, you can sort of see there it's a 3% improvement. On the other hand, when we move to the combination of being the top quartile of the internet and the top quartile of income, then you can really see the data begin to pull away. And it seems to be that combination which explains people really being able to stay at home. Now, I have a question. I've got two more questions, which I'd just love to answer. Anna asks is, how representative is what are you measuring? And roughly, I would say if you did a back of the envelope calculation, SafeGraph in this data set is tracking around 5% of mobile devices in the US. And I think in terms of how representative it is, there's two things you might worry. First of all, many people don't have mobile devices. We tend to forget that. But, you know, many people do. So so our results are probably not going to be representative for the elderly, in particular, those over the age of 80. I think a bigger worry is whether or not we think that people who opt into having an app track their location at all times is representative. That is harder to study. My research on privacy would probably suggest that we may worry a little bit into selection that it tends to be younger people who are less concerned about that kind of tracking. So that would be my sort of concerns about how representative is. If you run a regression simply on population and number of characteristics of that census tract and how many devices there are relative to population, you don't see anything clearly jumping out of the data. Lynn has a question about the graph, and do the set of bars represent different states? And the answer is yes, they do in this graph. And you might be thinking immediately, well, gosh, when I sort of think about this, like these states are probably very different, right? We probably have Mississippi in one place and Massachusetts in another, for example. And when we get onto the regressions, I'm going to start to control for those differences across states. These are just the raw correlations we're seeing in the data. Now, if you excuse me, I'm going to get on to actually show you some results which are going to help us think about what Lynn brought up about the different states. And I'm afraid these are very unpretty regression tables. So let me try and explain what they mean if you're not an economist. So what we're doing here is we are running a regression on this variable of whether or not the percentage or proportion of these devices that are staying at home. And then we're putting out the correlations and how statistically significant they are relative to different characteristics of that particular region. Now, what's going to be different here is we actually have what we call fixed effects for each of the different states, which means I'm effectively now looking at variation within a state. So rather than it being Mississippi versus Massachusetts, I'm now looking at how different counties within Massachusetts vary in terms of internet penetration and income, and doing a comparison within states. So that's how you should read this table. Now, what I do here is I compare what's happening in February and in March. As you can see in February, the patterns are sort of pretty much, a nice sort of a check really on what you'd expect the data to look like. Regions that have more unemployed people tend to have devices that stay at home more. In general, very weakly, having a higher household income tends to make people less likely to stay at home. So it sort of passes the sort of gut checks about what you might expect in normal times. Now we're going to move on to March, and March here is going to be my measure of when we started really taking seriously the global pandemic. in the US. And I want you to see some quite interesting things, and this is just from the raw data. First of all, when we run a horse race in column 6 between income and the internet, we can see that actually it seems to be the internet and the diffusion of high-speed broadband which is really driving whether or not people are staying at home. Another thing I want you to notice is that people's behavior was pretty reactive to reported cases in their local area. And that's without any government reactions. So we do see a lot of human behavior in terms of reacting to the news they're receiving locally about reported cases. I have some results on race. Most of them aren't that notable, except that you do see a striking difference in the behavior of regions where you have a high percentage of Asians. In general, there we saw a lot more self-isolating behavior. So before I go on, these are just correlations, but they're correlations I found interesting. Does anyone have any questions about this particular table? Oh, so Anupam has got some nice ideas and saying, you know, how does this change over time, right? I'm measuring the first few weeks and how people are reacting to reported cases. I think it would be very interesting, and one can imagine doing it, putting in some kind of time trend, especially as we get more data for April, to see whether or not people end up behaving differently to reported cases as we go on. And I think that might be useful from a public health standpoint. Anupam also asked about plotters and bias. So I don't have data on political leanings in this particular paper. I believe there's been some correlational work done by a team of economists and political scientists, which show that there is some relationship between compliance with state directives and whether or not you're Republican or Democrat, but I don't have that in this paper. Now, Sally H has asked me whether or not my data reflect which areas, rural versus urban, showed the lowest or highest devices of home. And Sally, I'm very sorry, I don't actually have that particular table in the presentation, but if you look in the paper, I do have a breakdown of the effect of rural. And the effect of rural is very striking. If you're in a rural area, you tend to leave the house more. And that is exacerbated by whether or not there's a lot of internet. And that's actually in the appendix of the paper if you take a look, and I'm sorry I don't have it here, but I think your instincts are right that rural is an important story in another interaction. It's just not one that I'm focusing mainly on the internet here. All right, so I gave you some correlations, and now I'm going to move towards something which I don't want to go as far as saying that it's definitely causal, but it is somewhat more causal than the correlations I just presented. In that now what we're going to be doing is we're going to look at the precise effect of the imposition of a state directive. And we're then going to use that precise timing in combination with a series of controls at the census tract level and for each day to say this is going to give us a precise measurement of the effect of a state directive. And, you know, just going back to Sally's question about whether or not rural matters, I think the census tract fixed effects here probably absorb all the rural variation, which is one of the reasons why, you know, it was not so much a focus of these regressions. Anyway, what do I want you to take from this? I want you to look at column 1, and I want you to see the effect of a state directive. It's 4%. That's roughly around 10% relative to the average? I'm going to argue that's not much. It's surprising to me, well, maybe it's not surprising, but relatively the effect of the actual state directive, you know, was there and definitely very significant. But it doesn't seem that that precise timing was driving a lot of the shift in the stay-at-home behavior that we were seeing. Instead, it does seem to have been driven by people being nervous as reported cases increased in that county. Now, we go on and on in this table. And what I want you to move on is to column 5. And in column 5, what I'm showing is basically the main effects of the paper, which you saw somewhat in that figure, which is that, look, compliance with a state directive to stay at home, having a high income definitely helps. Having access to high-speed broadband definitely helps. But you take those together, you have a huge positive effect of over 6%. And then on top of that, the combination itself has an extra incremental effect of around 7.5 to 8%. So in other words, when we're really looking at who is able to stay at home after these state directives, it seems to be very much driven by this combination of high income and high internet. And what I want you to notice is that the base effect of the state directive is pretty marginal at this point. Now, Greg Ruston is asking, hi Greg, a very interesting question, which is how many people in a household are going out? And the answer is we don't have data on that. The data is reported at a census tract level in a way which means you can't demarcate a household. However, I am going to have some data about shopping behavior very soon, which may be informative which may be informative about the shopping question. In the data I had access to when I was writing this paper, I didn't have data about the distance that people went, but that is going to be released quite soon by Safegraph. We put in a request and we might be able to get something. What I can tell you right now is all I'm measuring is whether or not people leave around a 400-meter square circle around their property, which is how it's being measured at the moment. But I think you're right that you could probably, do a little bit of a better job about whether or not you're going out walking or doing something else. All right. And maybe actually, if we go to column 6 and 7, it's going to be somewhat suggestive about what these activities are, which are leading people to leave the house. I want you to see that in some sense, the effect of the internet and the combination of internet and income is strongest for weekdays. And I'm going to bravely suggest that suggests something to me about work and the combination of high income and high internet leading people to work at home. Weekends, we get slightly weakened effects. And I'll show you some data about shopping behavior, which is suggestive that perhaps the sum effect, there's still an effect on shopping behavior of high income and high internet, but it's a bit less pronounced perhaps than people's work patterns. Now, to sort of tease apart, well, what is it really that's driving this huge combination, this huge reinforcing effect between income and internet that we're seeing? What we thought would be, an obvious explanation is that rich people who have access to the internet also tend to be the kind of people who can do work remotely and not have to leave their house to do their work. And we went to the county business patterns data to get some evidence of this. And we actually piggybacked off a recent set of work in MBR where they tried to categorize what jobs and what tasks are most easily done remotely. And we looked at those job categories where over 70% of the time they felt they could be done remotely. And we mapped out, well, how many of those kind of jobs do you have in these different regions? And what you can see, and perhaps this wasn't particularly a surprise, but it's still interesting, is that in general, there's a large effect in having more of these kind of jobs, which are easy to do remotely if you're in a region with high income and high internet. So perhaps one of the things we're measuring is that the reason there's such a self-reinforcing loop between income and internet in our measure is that those regions are precisely the ones where people can make use of the fact they've got a white-collar job and the internet to work at home. Now, the second thing, which goes to Greg's question about shopping, is, well, you know, so you can either not leave the house because you're working, or and able to work at home. But another reason you might not leave the house is because you don't have to go out shopping as much. And so what a way we thought we could measure this is we used a different data set provided by SafeGraph. It's sort of more traditional retail data to try and measure what happened to visits to convenience stores throughout the period. And why did we choose convenience stores? Well, in some sense, these are the most discretionary of trips, right? If you sort of think about typical behavior before the pandemic, you go to a convenience store multiple times because you can't plan. And as a result, they're perhaps the easiest trips to retailers to cut back on. So that was our sort of thought, and we looked at these. And, you know, this is what I want you to see. I want you to see that in general, we see the internet after the directive is in place as having quite a profound effect on your ability to stop shopping in convenience stores. And so we certainly see that in the data. The one thing I did want to highlight, though, is that that pattern seems to be particularly pronounced for people in the top income quartile, in that before the directives, they were actually going out more to convenience stores than people in the bottom quartile of the internet. But after the directives, we saw a reversal of that pattern. So there does seem to be something in the data, though, you know, I'm going to say less strongly than for the working evidence, that rich people in areas with great internet have been able to more successfully cut down their discretionary retail trips. Any questions about any of these points about the mechanism? I will continue because I've got to my punchline then. So what I wanted you to see today with these initial results is that, yes, you know, social commentators are right. It does seem that the ability to self-isolate is a function of income. However, I've seen far less talk about this idea that high-speed internet and access to broadband is also very important. And if you measure the effects, it is actually more important. What's important too is that you might have think that somewhat these are substitutes, but they're not substitutes. Income and high-speed internet very much in our data are complements. And if you live in both a high-income region and you live in a region with lots of high-speed internet, then there's a self-reinforcing effect where people in that region are far more likely to be able to self-isolate. Now, you know, the question is, of course, mechanism. I'm not going to have anything completely direct about the mechanism, but I did present some evidence, you know, that it's probably not too surprising the root causes of this, in that the combination of high income and a high internet suggests you're in a region with the kind of jobs which allow you to work self-remotely successfully, meaning you don't have to leave the house. And also there's some evidence, though weaker evidence, that you're able to cut more discretionary retail trips. Anyway, the big punchline from this is to say that, you know, the digital divide, I think, is something that I've been optimistic about in recent years. Optimistic that perhaps the spread of smartphones and cellular would in some sense act as a replacement for the lack of penetration of high-speed broadband to some households. However, what this research is showing is that in this horrible situation we find ourselves in now, is that the digital divide matters more than ever. So I will say thank you and questions. So we have a few questions about the results. And so I'm going to make, they've got 3 questions come in about the results. And so if you bear with me, I'm going to go through back to the particular charts they were asking about. And, we'll talk about the interpretation. So the first question was about convenience stores. And as I say, this evidence is slightly weaker. And what I would like you to look at is that if we look at, I'm bringing in my mouse hopefully here, this pattern, what we see is that after the directive for the bottom quartile of income, everything has gone down, and it looks pretty much like it's gone down, relatively proportionally. The reason I was picking up the interaction between the top quartile of the internet is that we see a certain reversal of the pattern when we look at behavior before the directive and after the directive. And that's all I'm picking out. You can look at the graph many other ways. So, one thing you could look at is that certainly in terms of levels, I would say that it's the levels for the bottom quartile of income, but top internet, and top quartile of income and top internet look pretty similar. Right. Now, the next question I have is one about why are income level and broadband access multiplicative? And this is simply coming from an interaction in the data. And what I want you to look at, and this requires sort of reading regressions like an economist, is this particular column 5. And what I'm going to talk you through what it means. This number of 3 means that basically if you have a state directive and you live in a high income area, then you're 3% more likely to stay at home. If you live in a high income area and there's high internet, then you're 3.4% more likely to stay at home. But together, and this is additional, if you live in the combination of a high speed internet area and a high income area, then there's an extra 1.5%. And so taken together, they're more than the sum of their parts. So that's anonymous attendee, as you're called. That's the argument. It's coming from the regression table. Now, Greg has an interesting question, which is, high income and high internet penetration seems to me a bit odd. Most non-rural high-income people have broadband regardless of the census tract they live in. So I'm not sure why there would be a measure using both. All right. So I think this is, this is sort of, I think that's the question of, how is really identification coming here? Because if you think about how I'm getting identification of these effects in the table, basically what I'm doing is I'm looking at those census tracts where you have the odd combination of either low internet but high income and high income but low internet. And we're comparing across, what happens in those areas relative to the more expected combination of high income, high internet and low income, low internet. And what I was a bit worried about, well, really how representative are these regions? And so one of the things I drew in the paper was a map of where they were. And what I'd say is that they were all over the place. They weren't in a particular area of the country. And often say the combination of high internet but low income could be explained by something like you're in a county of North Carolina, you're outside the main triangle area, but you still have access to high internet but low incomes. And so you should take a look at that graph and see sort of, well, do you believe that these are really quite essentially random, which is what we're sort of arguing. Now, Anne has a question, which is what income bands constitute high and low? And quite honestly, I've been a little bit, I've tried to put too much into this presentation by using lots of different measures. So in this particular graph, I'm using a top quartile, bottom quartile. From memory, we're talking bottom quartiles below around 35,000. Top quartile is above 100, but I could look into that to you. But there's quite a stark difference in the average income level in these, in household income level in these regions. Right, do we have any more questions? Or maybe I should be handing it back to Scott.
Well, actually, I have a question.
Okay.
There didn't seem to be a way for me to type it. So this extends Greg's question just a little bit. And what do you think the implications are for policymakers? Does this suggest a way forward, for example? Because it's not, it probably isn't just enough to plop a bunch of high-speed connections onto people who don't have them. Or is it that simple? It's hard to believe that it would be, but what does this tell us about a way forward?
So I'm going to be in danger here of extending out my paper beyond what the tables say, because I've spent a lot of time with the American Community Survey data and focusing on the people who don't have access to the internet and what they look like. And there's pretty much, you know, when you look at that data, there's a lot of evidence that this is simply about income, quite honestly. It's not, you could have people living in the same region, you know, similar access, alleged access to the internet, but the effect of income on your decision to whether or not you have high-speed broadband, you know, is really very profound. That and age, you know, matter a great deal. And so, you know, I've been wallowing in the data about whether or not the effect of receiving, for example, SNAP benefits, that's, you know, the new name for food stamps. And they're, you know, for a household with kids, if they're receiving food stamps, you see a sort of 15% dramatic difference in whether or not they have high-speed broadband. So I think, Scott, I'm going to be slightly paternalistic here and say I don't think this is about access. This is about income a lot of the time. And it's not about, you know, whether, you know, I know a lot of the debate has been about infrastructure, but what we're seeing now is just huge income effects in people's access. I don't know what you say to that. Maybe I've just completely floored you, but
no, I think you're saying it's I mean, it's an income effect, and it's a factor of inequality.
Yeah. And this is what I think I'm trying to show is it's very, very self-reinforcing in this pandemic. You know, I was looking at one of the striking pieces of data I've been looking at is that, you know, I've been looking at households which lack kitchen facilities and have children in them. And, you know, there are many, many children living in such temporary housing situations. And there we're seeing sort of 40% gaps, 50% gaps. in ability to access any kind of fast internet. You know, so I mean, I just don't think we can ignore the huge income effects in this data.
And so you also have some work, you're extending this work a bit, right? In terms of what we might learn for lifting the bans, the social distancing rules.
Yes, so we've been, I mean, you know, so we started off, we started off this project because I was just really interested in the role of inequality and how it played out in ability to social distancing. But I think in some sense, you're right, the bigger policy question for anyone who's a digital economist is, well, what can we say about lifting, you know, emerging from social distancing? As a first order point, we obviously don't have data about this. But what we can say is that as we lift restrictions, my data would suggest, and the correlations I've recorded would suggest, that people are still scared and still want to stay at home. They're not necessarily responding to state directives, but their ability to do so is going to be very much moderated by their internet access in a way, you know, which does seem to be a public health concern. You know, I'm sure there are possibilities of running bad regressions, bad correlations, right? To see, to take these results and then say, well, you know, does it have effect on deaths or spread? You could do that. I think that'd be a bit brave because that'd be very correlational, but that seems also useful.
It looks like Judith Mariscal has her hand raised. I'm going to click allow her to talk. So Judith, you have a question. I think you're muted at the moment though. There, now you're not. Now you still are.
There?
Yep, now you're here.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think the video is on. I don't see why, but anyway, sorry. Very, very interesting. Thank you for the talk. I'm going to go back, and maybe this is beyond the scope. Well, I'm sure it's beyond the scope of what we talked about today, but talking about inequality, would you have a suggestion in terms of what a digital policy can do? I mean, inequality is a huge policy problem, but in terms of the short-term pandemic response of public policy, in terms of access to broadband, do you have any thoughts?
So do I have any thoughts? So what we're seeing right now is some policies by some large telecom communicate firms of extending cellular data. But in my opinion, the way they're extending it is not really acting as a substitute for broadband because you still are subject to lots of speed limits. And so if I was to look for policy intervention, it could be there because quite honestly, trying to improve the state of, what you see is that if you're poor, you're far more likely to be relying on a cellular connection. And perhaps what we can be doing as a society as a temporary fix is working ways of sort of substituting, of allowing people who are low income, who are relying on cellular connections to better be able to say use them for tethering in order to actually allow, more profound internet interaction online. That seems a sort of short-term thing we can do. Otherwise, we're sort of looking at, more subsidies for people, as I say, for example, on food stamps is the way that we can also use that as an indication of a way of targeting people with subsidies for broadband access as well. Those are things that are coming out of the data. I imagine that everyone who's a policy specialist is just like, she can't say those things. It's too expensive. Don't say those things. The FCC will never do it. But, in my naive economist way, those are the sort of things which I'm seeing in the data.
Thank you.
You see that there's a question from Anupam.
So Anupam has a question just about identification. And, it's a nice question, which is that ultimately, is the timing, we have timing issues. We have, is the timing endogenous to the political leanings of the state and all of those things. What we're really using for identification here is whether the governor said it came into effect at 5 p.m. on Tuesday or 5 p.m. on Wednesday. We're using those very small variation in timing to try and measure exactly the effect of the state directive. I think when you look at the simple before and after graphs, what you're saying is, you're going to have to be very wary of, in that, if you just look before and after direction without looking just sharply at the timing, that there's going to be a lot baked in there, such as political leanings and so on. I would say, though, if you look at the state results, remember, I'm controlling at the state. So there, if you think that the governor is going to rule the entire state, for example, in Massachusetts, I'm looking at, a situation where we have the governor we have with his political leanings, and you're comparing between Middlesex County, which is where I live, and it's generally very prosperous, with, say, Worcester County, which is, far away from Boston and less prosperous. So we're sort of looking at those two different demographics, even within a state with which you might say ends up with a governor of similar, the same political leanings.
Okay, last opportunity to ask a question. Oh, another question.
Oh, Anna Pam's asking, so no, we didn't look at any city level directives. We just looked at the state level. There were some issues with that, say with Washington, for example, state where there was a city level, actions before the state. It didn't seem, we didn't see anything too interesting in that data.
Okay, well, Catherine, thank you so much for doing this with us today. This is a fascinating paper, and I'm really glad you could join us and present it.
Well, thank you for allowing me to share my work. It was really nice to get some such early feedback.
Good, and thanks everyone for attending. We will hopefully talk to you all again soon. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you again, everyone.